Something happened to Georgia O'Keeffe in the summer of 1946 that nobody talks about. She had reached the very peak of her career, making history as the first woman to ever have a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Her name was being whispered across the art world with awe and reverence. For years, she had fought to earn her place among the giants, and finally she had done it. But just as the world began to celebrate her, everything fell apart. Within weeks of her greatest triumph, her world collapsed in silence. For 10 long days, she disappeared. There were no news reports, no missing person alerts, no mention in the press. Even her friends and family remained strangely quiet. What could possibly make everyone agree to hide a disappearance? The truth would become one of the most unsettling mysteries in American art history. Georgia Tato O'Keeffe was born on November 15, 1887, in a small farmhouse in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. She was the second of 7 children born to a hardworking dairy family. Though their lives seemed ordinary, the O'Keeffes had an unusual touch of old-world nobility. Her grandfather, George Victor Tato, had once been a Hungarian count before escaping to America after the Revolution of 1848. But that trace of aristocracy couldn't protect them from hardship. Her father, Francis, struggled with one failed business after another, and by the time Georgia was a teenager, the family's farm was falling apart. Poverty replaced comfort, and the shame of that fall left a permanent scar on her. She learned early on that dependence was dangerous, that survival meant control. The quiet, endless fields of Sun Prairie became her sanctuary. Where others saw loneliness, Georgia saw beauty. The bend of wildflowers, the curve of animal bones, the whisper of wind moving through tall grass. All these things spoke to her in a language no one else understood. Her mother, Ida, was refined and distant, carrying herself with quiet grace despite the family's struggles. From her, Georgia learned stillness, the ability to appear calm even when the world was crumbling around her. Those early lessons of solitude, beauty, and strength shaped the artist she would one day become. In 1902, her father's final business collapse forced the family to leave Wisconsin for Williamsburg, Virginia. He tried one last venture, producing concrete blocks for construction, but the idea failed. Their new home was smaller, their prospects dim. To make matters worse, Georgia's mother grew ill with tuberculosis and spent her days bedridden. Watching her family crumble, both financially and physically, carved a deep determination into Georgia. She swore she would never live a life that depended on anyone else. At just 10 years old, she began taking watercolor lessons from a local artist named Sarah Mann. Her sisters Ida and Anita joined her. But even then, Georgia was different. While others carefully copied the shapes and flowers in the art books, Georgia began experimenting, breaking lines, stretching forms, painting what she felt instead of what she saw. It was rebellion disguised as art. Her teacher scolded her for it. But that spark of defiance would one day make her famous. By 1905, she moved to Chicago to attend the prestigious school of the Art Institute. She lived with relatives to save money, spending long nights sketching under dim lamps. Her teacher, John Vanderpoel, recognized her talent immediately. She excelled in anatomy and even dissected skulls to better understand structure and proportion. But just a year later, her body betrayed her. She contracted typhoid fever, a brutal illness that left her weak and bald. She returned home in defeat and stopped painting for more than a year. That near-death experience changed her. It stripped away her youthful idealism and replaced it with a quiet intensity, a drive to create something eternal. When she recovered, she headed to New York and enrolled at the Art Students League, where she studied under the legendary William Merritt Chase. There, she learned confidence and precision. In 1908, she won a prize for her still life of a rabbit and copper pot, a victory that earned her a scholarship to study at Lake George. But life, as always, had other plans. That same year, her father went bankrupt, and her mother's health deteriorated further. Once again, Georgia abandoned her art dreams and took a job in Chicago as a commercial illustrator. She spent long hours drawing lace and fabric for advertisements, soulless work that she despised. Years later, she burned most of those sketches, saying even the smell of turpentine made her sick. From 1910 to 1914, she barely painted. But in that silence, her vision began to shift. When she finally returned to art, it wasn't to imitate others, it was to explore herself. Her charcoal drawings from this period were raw, abstract, emotional. They weren't pretty or polished, they were alive. When her friend Anita Politzer sent a few of these drawings to the famous photographer and gallery owner Alfred Stieglitz in 1916, it changed everything. Stieglitz was stunned. Finally, he said, "A woman on paper who is pure." When Georgia met Stieglitz, he was 52 and already a titan of the New York art scene. She was 29, young, passionate, and unconventional. Their connection was electric. Soon, she moved to New York, living in an apartment he paid for. He was still married, but that didn't stop them. Their letters to each other, thousands of pages long, were full of desire, jealousy, and artistic obsession. For Stieglitz, she became both muse and masterpiece. For Georgia, he was both mentor and cage. Between 1916 and 1918, while living in Texas and teaching art, Georgia painted the vast, colorful canyons of Palo Duro. Those works were groundbreaking, fluid, sensual, full of life. Critics later called them erotic, comparing her use of form and color to the curves of the female body. Georgia dismissed those comments, but they followed her forever. One of those paintings, Special Number 21, was later stolen from a museum in 2003, never to be seen again. In 1918, tragedy struck again. She contracted the Spanish flu, which was ravaging the world. Her brother died in the war after being exposed to poison gas. Georgia painted a piece called The Flag, depicting a dark, trembling flag without stars. It no longer meant anything, she said. That same year, she moved permanently to New York to live with Stieglitz. He began photographing her, over 300 portraits, many nude. When he exhibited them in 1921, the public was scandalized. Critics focused on her body rather than her art. Though it made her famous, it left her feeling exposed, a woman defined not by her brush, but by her skin. By 1924, Georgia and Stieglitz married. But it wasn't love as much as it was necessity, a quiet agreement between two people bound by art and history. Their union was passionate yet toxic. He was controlling, she was fiercely independent. By the late 1920s, their marriage began to collapse. Stieglitz started an affair with a young woman named Dorothy Norman, a betrayal so public that Georgia's humiliation became a matter of gossip columns. In 1933, overwhelmed by heartbreak and exhaustion, she suffered a nervous breakdown and checked herself into a hospital. For nearly 2 months, she couldn't paint. Yet out of that darkness, her most powerful work emerged. Her New Mexico landscapes, vast, burning, eternal, redefined American art. In 1929, she visited Taos for the first time and felt an instant connection to the land. The desert became her refuge. She collected skulls, bones, and rocks, painting them as symbols of endurance. Critics called her work strange, even morbid. She didn't care. The desert was her truth. But 1946 was the year her life changed forever. That summer, she made history at the Museum of Modern Art with a massive retrospective, the first ever given to a woman. It was supposed to be her crowning moment. Yet, only weeks after the opening, tragedy struck. Alfred Stieglitz suffered a stroke. Georgia rushed from New Mexico to New York to be at his side. For 10 days, she barely slept or ate. She kept a vigil beside his bed, refusing to leave even as his condition worsened. On July 13th, he died. Then she vanished. For 10 days, Georgia disappeared from public view. No one knew where she went. When she reappeared, she refused to speak about those days. Some said she retreated to a convent. Others whispered she had been hospitalized again. But she never explained. Instead, she quietly arranged his cremation against the wishes of his family and scattered his ashes over Lake George. It was the end of one life and the rebirth of another. After Stieglitz's death, Georgia dedicated herself to managing his vast estate, over 4,000 artworks and thousands of letters. For 3 years, she cataloged, donated, and preserved his legacy even as it broke her health. By 1949, she was exhausted. She left New York for good and settled permanently in Abiquiu, New Mexico, surrounded by red earth and silence. There, she began a new chapter, one defined not by loss but by freedom. The following decades were some of her most creative. She painted mountains, clouds, and desert bones with breathtaking precision. Her beloved mountain, Cerro Pedernal, "God told me if I painted enough, I could have it," she once said, became her spiritual home. And in a sense, she did have it. When she died in 1986, her ashes were scattered there. But her later years were not without struggle. In the 1960s, she began losing her eyesight to macular degeneration. By the 1970s, she was nearly blind. Most artists would have stopped. Georgia didn't. She continued painting, directing assistants by describing colors and shapes from memory. She also began sculpting clay, using her hands to feel form. Even blindness couldn't silence her creative spirit. In 1973, at age 86, a young potter named Juan Hamilton arrived at her door asking for work. He became her assistant companion, and some say her lover. The age gap, 58 years, scandalized the art world. Georgia only laughed. "Men, artists, always have young women," she said. "Why shouldn't I have a young man?" Hamilton cared for her until the end, and when she passed away in 1986 at age 98, she left him the majority of her $70 million estate. Her family contested the will, accusing him of manipulation, but after years of legal battles, a settlement was reached. Through it all, Georgia remained an enigma, proud, private, and fearless. In 1977, President Gerald Ford awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, calling her the First Lady of American Modernism. During the ceremony, she whispered to a reporter that she had one regret: "I chose art over children. I chose wrong." Few knew she had suffered multiple miscarriages in her marriage to Stieglitz, losses he coldly dismissed as blessings. She had hidden her grief behind her canvases, her loneliness behind the desert silence. In her final years, nearly blind and frail, she still painted from memory, vast skies, bones, and clouds that stretched to infinity. Her assistants recalled her describing colors so vividly that they could almost see through her words. On March 6, 1986, she died peacefully in Santa Fe. Days later, her ashes were scattered on the mountain she had painted hundreds of times, the same one she said God had promised her. The wind carried her dust across the desert, merging her forever with the land she loved. Yet, even in death, her story didn't rest. Her will became a battlefield. Her legacy was fought over in courtrooms, analyzed by critics, and exploited by forgers. But through it all, one truth remained unshaken. Georgia O'Keeffe had changed the face of American art forever. She had turned loneliness into beauty, pain into power, and silence into a voice that still echoes through time. And as for those 10 missing days in 1946, the days nobody spoke of, perhaps that silence was her final act of control. After a lifetime of being watched, studied, and exposed, maybe Georgia O'Keeffe simply vanished to reclaim something no one could ever paint or possess: her own mystery.